Perfect. All right, so for folks that have just joined us, our previous recordings, and then also sometimes when presenters have like slide decks, in the case of, our presenter from FHIR back in December, those can be found on that OwnCloud link. And so just reiterating, I think the housekeeping item we're using today rather than profiling, we agreed back in at the beginning of January to use this as a follow-up governance call, given some of the scheduling concerns that were occurring, I think, last week for having governance. So we want to make sure we give people proper time to be able to kind of reflect on and review this content. And so I apologize if you came here for profiles today. We'll discuss them, but a little bit more abstractly from the governance side of things. I think for our two main topics on the agenda that we've got that are known, the first, I don't see Ron joining. I know he said he was going to try, but he's actually out on he's actually traveling for work right now. And so I have his emails that he shared and the update regarding the discussion that was had at the International Council around basin core definitions. But we may, if I don't see him join, still require him to fill in some of the blanks, but I think at least I can kind of touch on what he shared over email to date. And then obviously there's the ability for folks to kind of read up on the agenda and the minutes as well. So that'll be part of the deck that gets posted to our OwnCloud. The second piece is just returning to where we were in the conversation, specifically documenting discussion items and questions that we had around the Canadian Common Data Standards for Interoperability FAQ that came out. We got about, I want to say, halfway through last time. I was just scanning where we left off in the document. So we'll return to that. Before I jump into any other items on the agenda, does anyone have anything they'd like to add that they want to make sure that we get chatting about today or that they set up for a future governance call? All right. Okay. Well, then we will jump right in. Bear with me again, because on this next topic. So at the HL7 working group meeting, one of the events that occurs is a convening of the International Council, the HL7 International Council, which is essentially the chairs from each of the affiliates, the HL7 affiliates, so HL7 Canada, HL7 UK, Denmark, etc. And they use, I think it's 2 or 3 days to update each other on what's happening within their own affiliate countries, projects that are occurring, requests or changes to things like affiliate agreements, as well as special topic presentations in the case that Ron brought forward around challenges that affiliate communities are experiencing around this core baseline, definitions not being formalized from HL7 to date. So like I mentioned, I'll put this is a publicly accessible, I think if you have a Confluence account, but I'll put it in the chat. Let me know for those who don't have it. This is the page for the International Council. It includes the meeting minutes, but the additional pages regarding some of the findings to date are also available as part of that Confluence as well. So the update I'll provide, and I think Ron can always chime in later and like I said, provide color context, was, we had some meetings as iGuide authors with some of the other nations that were participating and had established bases, baselines, basis, which is spelled BASIS, or cores. And just as part of kind of that natural meetup that I think I summarized in last week's presentation, we started to realize that, not only was there not a formal definition, but also there was a diversity in how each of us were actively using some of these concepts. Sorry, go ahead. Joni, were you saying something? Or maybe that was you joining in.
It was not me.
Okay.
Sorry, I think that was me dialing in, sorry.
Oh, no worries. Hey, Lorraine. I'm just giving the update that Ron gave over email regarding the base and core definitions. And Lorraine, I wasn't at that meeting. I had been traveling that day. I don't know if you were there on Thursday, in keeping me honest to any of the updates I'm providing, but feel free to chime in.
I can chime in, but I was not at the International Council.
Okay. So so where we had left off, basically, the iGuide authors reiterated the challenge that we're having, which is there isn't a definition, but we're all also using these kind of grassroots created concepts differently. And so Thursday, there was a discussion primarily around, confirming that it is appropriate and that we should be approaching this from a separation of concerns standpoint and trying to push for at least a formal definition to be defined, but not to focus on the labels right away until we actually had a bit of an idea of what the consensus was that came back from the National iGuide authors on the approaches that have been done to date. And so, I filled in some of the gaps just from Ron's email here, but I think that in understanding his slides, and I've attached some of them, I think this was the subset that was presented. What he wanted to set up was that there is kind of I guess it's like an information model and a logical model way of looking at some of these definitions. And that notably, there is a relationship typically between bases, cores, and use cases, though we know now that's not always a consistent relationship. And I know he presented kind of these being the high level takeaways, right? Baseline being more focused at the concept representation level, core being, applied within a specific context. I know one of the items that came up, and that there is actually a follow-up presentation from the Netherlands on, was potentially a challenge to this structure, which is to say that there are some folks like those in the Netherlands that, they do use this methodology, conceptual, logical, but really they start with core. They don't have the same equivalent kind of base as it's been described, though they do have, some structures that they've actually provided and that are available on that Confluence page. If folks are interested, we can kind of flip to them. Would folks want to actually see, I don't know if, because I wasn't there, if Alexander actually presented the slides, but he certainly did add them afterwards.
I'm happy to look at it.
Okay, let's see. So I'm in that Confluence page right now. If you scroll down to the actual, I think it's the agenda page.
Did you put that link in?
I will grab it now. You folks can see that Confluence page, right?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay, so if you scroll down all the way.
Well, I'm waiting for the link to it. I can see it on your screen.
Beautiful. So that's in the chat. So if you scroll down all the way on the agenda, this was the presentation that was added after the fact. And it's specifically on the strategy that's employed within the Netherlands to try to describe the relationships between what they consider their core and then more abstract concepts that are still created in FHIR that have this relationship to the core. And, additional information guides or implementation guides and how they relate back to this kind of central piece. So, without necessarily being there for Alexander's presentation, I don't want to speak too much over it, but I think we can start to see patterns like them having some of their iGuide packages have like a line around capability statements, right? Which was something we heard from some of the other nations like the UK, making the distinction of a base and a core potentially not having a capability statement, but domain guides having them, so that the types of conformance artifacts seems to at least be one of the established patterns for how people make the separation between what we might call like a domain versus a core versus, you know, a zib in their case, or maybe something more like a, you know, base concept. The other piece is now this secondary consideration or an international implementation guides, and how and where they will start to come into play with the established infrastructure and the established layering that already exists in the Netherlands. Because I think they've got something like a core that's been, I think, in trial use for a number of years, and like 20 plus domain related guides. So they're very far in their maturity and their use of this, and are having to think through how a definitional change and or expectations for how they relate to universal or international realm.
Yes, and they also have a significant install base of V3 there. Like us, they were early on in V3, so
Yeah.
yes. So underneath all this, they've got a significant install base of V3 there.
Yeah, and in terms of, so this was their presentation. In terms of the actual, their comparison against some of the other nations that may be a little bit more early on, they seem to have the most, let me just find Netherlands. The most actual kind of guides that had been progressed through their standards development organization. So you can, I'll put this out in there as well, if you want to follow along this way. You can read a little bit about what the Netherlands has contributed in terms of how their products are packaged, how many there are out there, their organization relationship to the development of these standards. But, you know, the more and more we get nations to start to contribute that, the more we start to see that not everybody who has, for instance, base profiles uses must support. And not everyone who, for instance, uses core uses it the same way that maybe the Netherlands is using it or the US is using it. And so I think what's really, really clear from this is that if we aren't careful in how our definitions describe relationships to content in country and content outside of country, that there are trickle-down impacts to both us as a Canadian community and to the other to the other communities of national iGuides that are out there. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to actually jump back to the update. Like I said, I know a little bit more about the IG implementation page. Do folks have questions about this update to date? Is this kind of aligned with what you were expecting to hear in terms of some of the differences that the nations are actually expressing in this around these two concepts?
There was a comment in the chat, so I'm pausing.
Oh, I think it was just Shannon indicating it was interesting content.
Yeah, so Australia also has a Australian core, which they've just published the most recent update to. The other thing is that there was a bunch of discussion and around must support and conformance last week. I wasn't in all of them.
Oh, you're referring to the folks who are starting to pilot the replacement proposal?
That I don't know.
Okay. I know that's.
I suspect so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in some of like the international patient access, which is one of those universal realm guides that are expected to have a little bit more nuance in how their dependencies or the relationships to nationally developed content is established. They've made the decision to and raise their hands as one of the initial pilots of a must support replacement proposal to essentially allow for a different type of tagging for expectations where it breaks it down by actors. So that was one key theme where folks who who were interested in, I think, that conformance mechanism, and then also a lot of conversation around, I think, trying to deduplicate the amount of otherwise duplicative profiles that were at least present in the US realm. I had heard a concern.
So that was somewhat separate, I think, from the US Core must support discussion that I heard on Thursday.
Got it.
However, I missed it, so I wasn't in there. Yeah, so anyway, the point is there's lots of shift happening.
And I think right now we have, as part of that shift, both a responsibility and also the opportunity to try to contribute as a, you know, agents who are impacted by these changes, right? So
Yes.
one thing that the folks in the UK core brought up to me was, you know, us as a community, as a baseline community, not even as a community that, you know, has an interest in the use of a core or some equivalent. Right now, we sit as one of the outliers on that IG page as being one of the only groups that develops, you know, essentially a base-like implementation guide, but that applies must support on top of it. And so we knew that there were always challenges around that and had our DDR process in place to ensure that we were eliminating the places where must support would cause additional issues for us downstream. But it's an interesting pattern and one that I think we should reflect on as we start to become an outlier on this page potentially, right? We know Estonia might be one of the others, but from what was shared last week and what's been shared to date on the table, I think that that's something that, in addition to trying to contribute to what should a core look like and how does it relate to a base, we have to consider from an approach standpoint of, you know, did we try to straddle the middle ground too much? As folks have looked at other bases and cores as they've come out in our international community, has the same thought occurred? Like whether or not we should be considering modifying our approach should a pattern be established that, you know, some constraints are okay, but must support really just doesn't show up that much in bases. Would the community be open to talking about that? Or would folks say, you know, I'm already really committed to the pattern that we have and we should be advocating for its kind of outlier expression?
I think we can talk about it. I think we also just need to remember that the reason for must support for the baseline is because of how flexible we needed to be in order to, you know, be implementable as a kind of a broad multi-use case baseline versus some of the other national specs that may not have the same requirements.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering about that concept of like the countries that aren't using must supports, or they have like a unified health system across the country, unlike Canada where we have each jurisdiction is different.
In the case of the UK, I think they face similar challenges as us in that they have like Welsh guides and the NHS, which publishes for England. Like, I think they're
I think most of them have similar challenges. I mean,
yeah.
Australia is the same. They have state-based regulations between New South Wales and Queensland and Western Australia, etc. The Netherlands might be a bit more unified, but I'm not sure. But I don't think that most of the socialized medicine systems are a lot different from the way we are.
In which case, like I would like to understand, to me, take some examples of some of our must support elements and see how they handle it in their specs then. Just so we have a sense of, what have we been missing in our definitions or vice versa.
I think what a lot of countries are doing is in their core, their base, whatever it is. It's broad and it's not intended, it's not use case specific. And so that those must supports show up in the use case specific implementation guides that are derived or influenced by the national core. And that's why they aren't using it. They don't expect it to be the finished product. They expect it to be the basis for something else.
Yeah, you can see these usage scenarios are pretty broad around essentially querying.
Just recently, I attended a conference conference the call, as well as they mentioned for the FHIR. Also took over actually Lloyd just FHIR ticket to the FHIR to. I think they have decided to put that actual obligation as extension. I don't know how far they will go, but the conformance team also argued this should be wait for their suggestions as well. As just I posted on the info way. There is also I actually received from the conformance CC list about the talk about this further discussion about mass support that Graham is writing support handling the document and a relevant document. And actually he gave quite lots of good suggestion there. And the main take I got is first, mass support itself actually is a little bit not only weak, also I use the word actually just supposed to be 2 legs on standing on the ground, actually just 1, because if you go revisit V3 mandatory and requirement, which is a 2 appearance constraint that unfortunately mass support might be classified as a requirement, but not, there's no mandatory that a piece of feeding the FHIR. There's only 1 item show there, and another one just to from the compute for the machine computable perspective, a mass support be utilized so widely as it is from use case perspective. So there's a quite a lot descriptive way to use mass support, which is the impact the computable mechanism of machine function, sorry, for the FHIR standard per se. So so that's why they brought in the obligation that a specific new concept, and also they would like what I tell from the document, they would like to put this mass support combined obligation go to the actor layer instead of go to profiling layer. That's what I take, but there's, as I do agree with the conformance teams and other folks, and there's a long journey to go to talk about how to implement it. But mass support might stay, but not at the conceptual level. Sorry.
In SDU1, the Architecture Review Board had a set of ballot comments on SDU1, one of which was around must support and the lack of clarity around what must support was, asking for it to be much clearer for both the sender and receiver, et cetera, what must support meant. And at the time, there wasn't a very clear way to define it. So they said implementation guides must define what they mean by must support. And so that's sort of the morass that we're in right now.
Yeah, I think that's a big problem because must support needs, I think it needs to have a standard definition, right? Like saying must support can be defined in each implementation guide just muddies the water.
Well, I think what the must support replacement proposal, my understanding is that it's still going to be defined in each implementation guide, but the depth and detail of the expectations are much closer when we look at like the types of obligation codes to what you would expect would be appropriate for, an end system to be able to describe as their expectations for how you interact with the, you know, the API or what the viewer will do with the information, etc. So I
It
put
is-
it in the chat, but it's still like, it's far out for, I think, when this will impact us. Because, you know, we're probably, well, we're not one of the pilot groups right now. And I think we've got, you know, a larger question, which is if we are a baseline and this continues to shape up, whether or not we would be considering must support at all or a must support pilot. So, you know,
Well, we already have in our existing baseline profiles must support declarations, and we have it a couple of times run up against challenges where we've asked for that to be relaxed because it didn't fit a
Mhm.
specific implementation in jurisdictions. So I don't think this is academic, frankly.
in what you, can you expand?
Well, in that because of the way we're using it, we're already hitting challenges of around what does must support mean, and what do we mean when we use it, and when should we apply it in the baseline. So that those three questions aren't academic for us.
We can certainly go ahead and use those extensions and convey what they convey. I don't know what these pilot groups are. I haven't been following that discussion, but once those things are out there, we should be able to just go ahead and use it, even if it
Well,
hasn't.
we can use them, but I'm talking more about when we declare directly in our baseline profiles that something is must support.
So I'll pull up an example so we can.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. I'll have to pull up an example on Simplifier and check out why we went to get a 403 again. 404.
And meanwhile, just wanted just maybe try to clarify my understanding. If we roll back to V3, and we can see the equivalent and appearance constraint there, and mandatory and requirements required, and a must support for my understanding fall into requirement side, which is required. From that point, actually, unfortunately, the must support itself, literally from the very beginning, I call it, there's some design defective. That's why my understanding right now from the HR7 FHIR community right now, and try to review this must support concept here, try to put more, how to say, grill bar, whatever, extra information, try to, make it clearer for both human and machine community perspective. And however, now it's just very early stage. We can go to the pilot, but this is very dangerous because of my understanding for that three, how to see triplet value set. There's quite a lot of content need to be discussed because my understanding they don't just stay inside HIE, domain scope anymore. They try to stretch outside and go to the repository domain, even go to the other area. There's quite a lot of discussion there. I would like to wait and observe and maybe evolve. But right now the must support itself is at a very how to see, I would say more like transition time, and we can temporarily put there, but down the road we'll see quite a lot of change. So I hope that there's no dramatic.
Well, so the idea with the new proposal is that you define actors. And this is borrowing on IAG and, well, frankly, like UML terminology. But you define actors within the system, within your IG, and it could be an HIE, and or a client, or it could be an EMR, or a lab system, or whatever. You define the actors, and then the obligations are associated with a particular actor, as opposed to with a specific data element. So you can, with your defined actors, you can say, you know, this actor needs to handle this data element in a particular way, and they've come up with a coded series of values that say, you know, you have to store it, you have to display it, you have to be able to send it, and or similar. But it all ties into the actors which you get to define. It may be a challenge for us because we are being agnostic to a use case, and therefore we don't have actors. But I don't know that, and I think that the key thing to adopting the new proposal is to come up with a series of actors, and then we can kind of go, yes, this system needs to do it, and this system needs to do it that way, and this system doesn't need to do anything.
Yes, and I can, if we go all the way back to G2, we did that based on generic actors like sender and receiver.
Yeah,
That's not a really actor, my understanding. First, I do agree with Elliot. And the change this time for the obligation, the actor being included, that's a really good, very big step. And I do agree with this step to bring in the obligation concept, this discussion. That's very important, which is also aligned with V3 concept there. I do agree with it. And the second, what I concern, just like the three streams of value set, which is the use word post coordinate, and also there's quite lots of content there, not stay inside HIE domain or scope, more stretch into the repository beyond, I would say beyond the HIE scope, which could bring some issues but I'm not 100% sure. My mind is still not clear as what they are writing there. They're writing there, and then definitely it's a long journey to go through those the course. Obligation, there's a right direction in the short, but must support it definitely need to go to the IG, far close. More close to development phase. Just as what I said, use case even not close enough. Just go to the IG, really directly deliver to the code developers.
So I'm going to bring the conversation back here in a second, because clearly there's a lot of interest in the must support replacement proposal. I want to bring us back to the governance side of things, because we're not at a point where we can reasonably say, you know, should we be making this decision? Can we put a beat on this conversation and maybe dedicate one of our profiling stream calls to reviewing the must support replacement proposal together, and then talking through, you know, our understanding of it, so that we can kind of loop back on the governance end of things?
I think that's reasonable, because I think there's two things here. There's, you know, where's the replacement proposal? And what do we think about it? How do we use it? And how are we currently using must support in our profiles, which we're already doing?
Yes. And so I actually, in the piece we haven't talked about yet, which I think may be even more impactful than just us being an outlier for use of must support in our profiles when we align to the baseline, is also that we are a bit of an outlier in that we don't have a formal definition for you know, whether or not and what the relationship from a mechanism standpoint would look like if a core was developed in country, and then what the relationship between use cases and the baseline are. So we know from the discussions that were had that nations are kind of modeling different approaches to that kind of 3-level view. What I want to potentially, you know, draw attention to is that when we're thinking about how folks are using our baseline profiles today, and we've given them options for how you claim a relationship with, what came out of some of the discussions last week were, you know, the challenge is if you then want to continue to have derivation occur from the guides that connect to you. And my concern is right now, let me know if you feel the same way, that if the definitions claim clear, okay, this has to be derived from this has to be derived from that, that potentially could represent a challenge for us as a community from a technical perspective of having too many nested relationships. If for instance, we anticipate many use cases to come out and have to, you know, follow that same linear inheritance. And so I want to bring it forward to the community that and I, again, they're not my slides, so I can't really speak to them, but if the definition does land in a place where the relationship between a baseline and a core indicates a clear mechanical derivation, that there will be impacts in our community, both for how we test and certify and publish, but also potential technical impacts for how we, how far we can create a line of inheritance, you know, in our respective jurisdictional and implementation specific guides.
Well, already in the past month, the British Columbia guides that are built against baseline, the baseline current disappeared.
Oh yeah, no, John reached out. It wasn't that it disappeared. It's the way that the package was being called. He updated it with the 1.13 or 1.
Okay, yeah, so he updated it to a specific version, but you know, the referencing to current shifted. But regardless, it does mean that, you know, when we are deriving off of each other, if there's a problem in one layer, it affects all of them.
Yep. Yeah, and so that's the con of this, right? So in some ways, if we're saying, hey, a definition that claims the baseline must be used would benefit us, there is also a clear con that we take on, which is, you know, issues around updates and stability, right? Create more fragile environments for us to work in, especially as we add additional nodes upstream. So, you know, I know folks are pushing for, in your jurisdictions, you want to ensure that, like, formally the baseline is accounted for, but we have to be very careful in the mechanisms that we ask for it to be accounted for, because if it's true derivation, we incur more risk for the scenarios like what Lorraine described. So as folks have been thinking about, and I don't think Ron had a chance to chat through these definitions with folks, but I know there's desire to. Like
I had a chance to chat through them with individuals, but not with the group. And he did present them to International Council. But in terms of, you know, the Canadian community, I don't think so yet.
Yep. And so one of the takeaways when Ron gets back is, like, we absolutely need to talk through with him what the definition is and that's being proposed and what its impacts are, both positive and negative to us from the baseline and in our respective guides.
Well, I think it goes beyond, I mean, Ron is trying to make sure that he facilitates the discussion, but we also have to discuss this with the TILA and others in InfoA.
Yeah. On the, you mean on the core set of things? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'll say is, as an update, I think that, like, folks, I think we have to be able to stay tuned to this. And in thinking through how you see using this content and how you anticipate guides will be established in your jurisdictions, starting to think through that so that when we have these discussions on what is the proposed definition that International Council has received, then we can at least react to it as a community and think through you know, the potential impacts, whether they be good or bad. So the slides as well as the minutes, I've probably taken too much time on this item as is, for the fact that we don't have Ron on the call, are in the deck. When Ron is not traveling, I'll ask if he can make it a special point to attend ideally our next governance call, but I don't know his travel plans yet.
I don't think he's back until the middle of February
Got it. Okay.
because he goes from Sri Lanka to Dubai in a week in advance, and right now he's got COVID.
Mm.
So he's not even attending his meetings in Sri Lanka because he's sick. Yeah, so I have no idea. But it's going to be at least the middle of February.
So folks, like, does it merit us having further conversation on what we would pose a definition to be like before then? Or do we want to wait?
We can discuss it and keep it ready.
Okay. Okay, so let's see where we can get with the FAQs, and then we'll continue the discussion around if we are, you know, looking at our baseline definition and then looking at the iGuide implementation table that is updating, whether or not we think some refinements may be required for some of the content that's present in Ron's slides.
I'm more focused on the scope and
Yeah.
in the definition, and just, you know, first we needed to focus on our baseline, the scope discussion, and second we need also keep asking the InfoWay plus FHIR, what's their core, the scope of the core. So to use scope list of these two set to do the comparison might be easier, because sometimes description too high level, too high to do the comparison.
Yeah, and I know one of the changes we did last week was just to put a little indicator that potentially, like, things like scope in our current definitions of how we differentiate between baseline and core may continue to change as these definitions become formalized. Okay. Okay, so recapping where we were on the 6th for the FAQs. So we started to compile questions, comments, asked for clarity. We left off specifically on this baseline and core relationships. I think the main takeaway from this item, and I'll do my little 2-point view, was just that what was asserted in terms of the statement on the FAQ was slightly different than what was said verbally, and that we need a little bit more clarity on what the expectation is and potentially correction to make sure that the FAQ represents.
To be frank, it was more than a little different.
Yeah, that's true. So the biggest
Yeah.
things being that retiring or replacement over time. I think we talked about over time being not defined. So because we didn't have the folks who drafted the FAQs, we didn't have the context for whether or not we were interpreting it correctly. You know, 1 year versus 10 versus 20 could mean a dramatic difference in how this is interpreted. So we left off, where was it? I think on this, no, not public health billing. We left off on the last question around a core. So is it going to be done in a similar approach, which is where this concern was raised, I believe. Someone correct me if they are thinking it was a different section in the document, but I'm fairly certain that's where this discussion arose from. Okay, so this is, I'll pull it up so you guys can see a little bit more. So I think this was a reference to, this was a verbal reference, and they included the slide below to describe what was meant when they said Abby's $1 million slide. So we've got, hold on. It seems our data models developed by CHI stats can. We get pushback from clinicians when we look for them to capture data that doesn't arise from the normal course of care. Is there a minimum data set or superset? Okay, so these were follow-up questions, I think that actually might have been shared. Where there are specific questions or concerns with the content that was raised in the FAQs around the data model like process slide. I know when we last met on this, you know, one of the takeaways was for folks who hadn't had a chance to review this, to scan it for concerns. I don't know if maybe it's a little bit further along where folks have some challenges, but I'm happy to kind of push past this question or this, I guess, clarification into the next verbal question that was the FAQ was on. Okay.
There's quite lots of questions about this EMR MBS. And first, I don't know, this is the actual minimum data set will be used for data submission or not so far, at least from this document here from the back to the patient summary project conversation. There's quite lots of a gap between the clinician practice and with the actual data that will need to be collected, not to say, and there's quite a coding issues there. I mean, from terminology perspective, just as I said, from from terminology working group, they just finished the one-way mapping from SNOMED City to ICD-10 and for the primary care section. And I question if it will be used for the CHI EMS, MDS. They said that they might. From that point, I would say this is
Yeah, and what CHI is looking for in terms of data analysis and statistics is often broader and larger than what clinicians are trying to do for direct care. And there's sometimes a bit of a conflict there between CHI's needs and primary care needs.
And I think that's what's reflected here, right? In this answer around having to consult with clinicians on what is in that Venn diagram, making sure it makes sense to clinicians and patients. It's only about what hits screens for physicians. Primary care is larger than that. So was there a follow-up to this piece? So Thomas, what I'm hearing from you is it's really important to acknowledge that the importance here to stay scoped to the content that's intended for the data model.
Yes,
I'm
actually,
hearing is that like they're in planning for engagement of some clinicians to help ensure that.
I hope so. And what I quoted as this so far, they might fall in the chicken egg chasing circle. That's what I can tell. And also, it doesn't mean they might fall in how long, but from political environment, what I heard from the news and our Justin Trudeau tried to talk with different jurisdictions about some kind of action plan, whatever. If that action plan include this work, we will see some strong force to push this work forward. But nobody knows. We will stay tuned.
Yeah, and Christine, I'm going to take you up on your offer in the chat around adding some context around, I think it was this particular set of question and answers, right?
Yeah, I'm working on trying to unmute myself here. Hold on. All right. Okay, so I think you guys can hear me now.
We can.
Okay. I was just, I don't know if I'm on camera or not. I'm not used to using Zoom as much. I use Teams a lot more. I was just maybe at a high level, I was just going to mention, I know that this was coming off the presentation that had been done with CHI and InfoWay introducing some of our planning at a strategic level as to what we're doing with Stats Canada to help support the Pan-Canadian data strategy. And in that pipeline around the data exchange and content standards, specifically around primary healthcare, what we're doing is we do actually have a team that's been redeveloping the content standard for primary healthcare. So actually kind of moving away from what CIHI would have typically done in the past, where we would develop a minimum data standard for for secondary use in order to develop certain indicators off of it. So what's happening right now is that the work is being led by a clinician here at CIHI to with a huge environmental scan with a team of folks to redevelop that standard for those data elements that are actually used at the clinical primary care use or for primary use period. And then from that work, there's going to be a draft that will be put out later on this year for intensive consultations across the provinces and territories, clinicians and vendors, and a couple other stakeholders and forums. So that's one piece of work that's happening right now as part of the planning and the development of the primary healthcare standard. And that standard, the goal is that it'll become part of a data model that we are going to be developing that is going to be set on a common set of data elements and entities across multiple sectors, building on what already exists in the healthcare system. So we're not actually starting from scratch. And this model with all the documentation is actually going to be put out for consultation as well and for feedback. But it's going to be scoped very small as a starting point. So we're not coming out with 200 data elements modeled for multiple sectors at once. It's going to be very small amounts, and it's going to be iterative. And we're working very closely with InfoWay as well. So I think there was a question around the PSCA and how that all fits in. And that's correct. Like, it is part of this bigger picture that we're working towards. So I don't know if that has helped brought any
I think
context.
it does. Well, and I think it does
questions.
provide some color context, but yeah, if there were further questions on that, or that we want to submit formally too.
So nothing is final. Nothing is nothing's completely developed. There's nothing happening right now that you are not aware of. And there's going to be more to come. We will be doing a lot of engagement on all the work that's happening. Yeah, so there's that slide that you brought up. That's the plan for the primary healthcare data standard. So it's really about redeveloping the data standard at the individual level. So what is that information that's needed at the clinical setting to provide care to a client in primary healthcare? And then what kind of data do you need at an operational level for decision making? And what does that look like at a pan-Canadian level? This is where CIHI's scope comes into play. And then population health.
If the jurisdiction wants to get involved in how it's developing or monitor how things are going, how do they do that?
No, we want the jurisdictions involved, and they will be engaged with us. I'm not sure who I'm speaking with right now.
Sorry, I'm just a participant on one of the jurisdictional teams. I don't have any decision-making power.
Right.
But it doesn't seem clear how the collaboration and the feedback is working.
We haven't started yet. So that's probably why it's not clear. There is going to be a stakeholder engagement plan. And that's also, so everything right now that I am speaking to and that's been spoken to you is all part of the strategic planning around the approach and the work that's going to be happening. I don't have more details than that, but there's a couple different pillars that are being worked on at once as well. So I think InfoWay has InfoWay and CIHI. I don't know if it's in this slide deck that you're sharing, I can't remember, but there's the 6 pillars that we're working on together. And so where CIHI is collaborating with InfoWay in Stats Canada specifically is on the development of a pan-Canadian governance structure for interoperability, as well as the work around the content standards, and then the exchange of that. But also there's a vendor activation pillar. I don't have them in front of me, so I can't be kept honest right now. I have to try to pull it up, but it's easier if I'm reading from something. So let me see if I can pull this up.
Well,
while I'm
and I
talking.
think that was a question that we had the last time that we reviewed this, right? Which was how do we, from the baseline perspective, but then also
Yeah,
if we're implementers. Our approach last time was to start to collect some of these questions that weren't necessarily answered in the FAQs or comments or asked for clarity, and to submit them through, I think, the listserv email on the forum post where the FAQs were posted. I'm wondering if it makes sense, just given the time constraints. We didn't know if there would be folks who would be able to answer the questions right away, but to have maybe some targeted time in one of our next governance sessions after we've kind of given you the update on what's been asked to date, to hear if there are ones that we have answers for yet. Does that make sense, Christine?
yeah, that makes complete sense. And then one of the things that I know our group will be doing is we will be going out to the different forums in order to share the work that we're doing. And also when it comes to the consultative pieces, when we're putting, we will be putting things out externally for that feedback as well. So I guess all I have to say at this point is, yeah, definitely send us the questions that you have. And when we have something else to show and talk about, then we can reach out to you and have it presented at this forum as well, if that's something that you'd want us to come and do.
Okay. Was there any other questions that folks have that they want added to the list? Again, from a baseline perspective, but that needs to be represented because essentially these are all going to just go in a bucket to that email for submission. Are we comfortable with what we have to date as a starting point? Sorry, better question is, are we not comfortable with what we have as a starting point to submit it, carry on the conversation, but to not, hold back on sharing what we reviewed and asked for clarity so far?
I think that's a good approach.
Okay. All right. So then I will save this. We'll make the recording and the slide deck available on that OwnCloud link that I think Joni shared in the first text of the chat. And then we will submit the questions and requests for clarity. And ideally, Christine, maybe coordinate with you and your team on what would make sense as a good avenue to hear back any of the responses that there are clear answers for. We can do that offline just ahead of the next governance call.
Okay, yeah, that sounds perfectly fine with me. And yeah, definitely. Like I said, you really have all the information.
Yes, yeah. I mean, not to say that you have to have the answers, just the best way of getting it to you, and then
yeah,
getting answers that filter in as they are known.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yep. Okay. All right. Thanks, folks.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Have a good
Bye.
weekend.